All right. This is our first webinar of the month for Sexual Assault Awareness Month. And typically we would be running different events and being on many panels, but given the situation with COVID, we are making all of our programs accessible virtually this month. And today we'll be focusing on what is sexual violence and looking at it from the Muslim perspective. So a disclaimer that our funding for this series of webinars is from the Office of Violence Against Women, and the disclaimer is that the content in this presentation does not necessarily reflect their views. So just their disclaimer that we have to put on all of our content.
Samira,
Yes.
Could you spotlight the interpreter? Yes, perfect.
Okay, good. I pressed pin, but I don't think that worked. Thanks for that.
No worries. Participants, if you can see the interpreter, please let us know in the chat box. Perfect. Thank you all.
Yes, thank
and
you.
Feel free to introduce yourselves as well.
All right, I think Nabila, I'll pass it to you.
So yes, we are HEART, and HEART is actually known to be an acronym, which we love. And so HEART actually stands for Health Education, Advocacy, Research, and Training. And they also happen to represent our programming. So with that being said, health education, with that particular programming, we offer campus and community workshops. We have a virtual educator service through our virtual peer educators. And we also have virtual resource center that houses our blogs and a lot of our resources, which some you will see today. We also have our heart-to-heart videos that capture informational content that are about like 5 to 10 minutes long. Our advocacy programming arm includes one-on-one advocacy. So a lot of times it's trained advocates in sex education and anti-sexual assault advocacy that offer support, information, resources, and any necessary referrals. You'll see that it is very much typical to your case management. We also offer systems advocacy, so looking at the larger picture. With our research and programming arm, we collaborate with academic research institutions to better understand the sexual and reproductive health needs of Muslim communities. And lastly, our training arm program that offers capacity building trainings and technical assistance to equip mainstream professionals and also Muslim leaders to better serve the sexual and reproductive health needs of Muslim communities. So this year, 2020, has been such an interesting year so far. And something you'll notice is now we're here virtually with you all. 2020 also marks our 10 years of HEART, so we're celebrating. Not only are we celebrating 10 years, but we're also going to celebrate the fact that we're trying to cultivate community online with you all so that we can be more accessible. And it's super exciting, and we have a lot of projects and announcements, so definitely stay tuned. At HEART, we also want to ensure that all Muslims have the resources, language, and choice to nurture sexual health and confront sexual violence. And we also envision a world where all people are free from sexual violence and thrive in the communities that they live, work, and pray in.
So we have some virtual agreements since we are using the Zoom webinar platform for the first time. As you all can see, your video and audio will remain off, and feel free to use the chat function. Just so you all are aware of, a lot of you are sharing on the chat function, and I believe only panelists can see that. I'll try and change that so that you can communicate with each other. If you do have questions, please ask them in the chat function. We will be having some polls during the webinar that you can all interact with. And if time runs out, we will post your remaining questions and answers on our social media, so you'll have access to that. And as you all know, this webinar is being recorded, so we will post it on Facebook as well as our YouTube channel afterwards. So if you miss anything or have to leave early, you can feel free to view this as many times as you need and would like to do after the webinar ends.
So with our community agreements, we tend to begin all of our trainings with engaging with participants around what we want to agree with during our sessions. But this usually takes about 45 minutes, which we don't have. So I want to highlight a few that we may hopefully refer to later on. But one of the things that we also want to highlight is that we've been doing community agreements to some degree during the beginning of Heart's time. And it's a way to cultivate safe spaces that really consider the nuances of this work and how it impacts survivors. We also want to give credit to the Move to End Violence program through Novo that has helped us deepen this work further and allows us to explore what folks need to feel safe while having these conversations. Like I said, normally we like to engage participants around these agreements and have small group conversations, but due to time and the fact that we are virtual, um, we're just going to share the 12 that we have, and we would love for you to read through, think about them, and if you have any questions, feel free to share in the chat box. One other thing that I would like to note about the community agreements is that for Muslim communities, this serves as more than just an agreement. It truly aims to get to the bottom of what is happening in our communities that serves as blocks to addressing sexual violence, especially since self-assessment is not happening and internally resolving any issues or disclosures that come up occur at the expense of survivors, which in turn causes more harm. So one of the things that we've noticed that's really challenging in our communities is this idea and the reality of simultaneity. And simultaneity is also number 10 on this community agreement. Simultaneity is also, to explain it, it's considering multiple truths, it's considering the both and also just the idea of sitting with the discomfort of that reality. And so challenging all of this through urgent response is something that we are trying to get to and say that there is no quick fix. So we really just wanted to uplift some of these. And again, if you have any questions for any of them, you can put them in the chat box.
So we have 3 learning objectives for today's webinar. The first is for you all hopefully to have a common understanding of terms related to sexual violence and to be able to talk about sexual violence and how often it happens in Muslim and non-Muslim spaces. The second learning objective is to apply the definitions that we're covering to some scenarios so that you're able to put them into practice and understand how complicated situations of sexual violence can be. And the last thing that we'll cover this afternoon is to understand how sexual violence can manifest in Muslim communities and how it appears in very nuanced and distinct ways. So we'll dive into the first part of the webinar, which is going over definitions and prevalence of sexual violence. So typically, if we were all in a room together, this would be a very interactive activity where we'd make you all do some work. So we've changed it for the webinar, and we'll be doing it using a poll. So on the screen, you see a list of common terms that are associated with sexual violence. And instead of giving you the definitions of these, which would mean you're listening to our voices a lot, we're going to be showing scenarios on the screen. We'll read the scenarios out, and then we'll share a poll where you get to vote which of these terms applies to the scenario that you're seeing. And there's no points for this, there's no score. So it's all good. So this first scenario, and we will say that some of these do deal with details around sexual violence, so to please take care of yourself during this webinar if any feelings do come up. This is a pretty content-heavy webinar series. So the first scenario sees a Quran teacher texting one of his 12-year-old students. He jokes around with the student and makes a comment about how handsome he is. The Quran teacher then sends a shirtless picture of himself to the student, saying that he's been working out, and asks the student to send one back. The student hesitates, and the teacher says that he wouldn't want his parents to hear that he is struggling with Arabic and will never be able to memorize the Quran. So I'm going to pull up a poll for this first scenario. So you should see the scenario on the screen and some multiple choice boxes. So as you read the scenario in the poll, if you could select what's happening in the scenario with regards to aspects of sexual violence. And we'll just give it a few moments as a lot of votes are coming in. All right, wonderful. Most people have voted. All right. So the highest choices that are showing up, number one is showing up to be child sexual abuse, which is absolutely correct since we are dealing with a minor in this situation. The second one at 80% is power and control, which we do see being manifested, given that the Quran teacher is in a position of leadership and power. The third one is sexual harassment, which we will go into in detail a little bit later, but unwanted sexual attention absolutely happening. Some other ones that are showing up are emotional abuse. Spiritual abuse is showing up with regards to the intimidation factor of the Quran and how well perceivedly the student's doing. So that feels like you all were able to find out what's happening in that scenario. So we'll end the poll and move on to the next one.
So for this one, we're going to switch it up a little. Given our current context, we created this one. One partner threatens to throw out the other partner from the apartment if they cough and keep them locked out to prevent themselves from getting COVID. So we'll pull up the poll and take a moment to reflect on what you think is happening here.
So we'll just take a brief pause as I switch the pin video. Spotlight the video, my apologies. Perfect. All right. I actually realized I can share the results. I'm going to end the poll and then share the results. So you all should be able to see this, and Navila too.
Absolutely, yes. So coming in with the most votes is power and control at 93%. And yes, absolutely, there is power and control going on. And we will also talk about power and control, not in today's webinar, but in the webinar that's going to happen on the third webinar. Coming up at 88 is intimidation. And yes, we see a lot of this happening in terms of different cases, especially during this time with an increase in intimate partner violence and domestic violence, the use of intimidation, and also this idea of intimidation to isolate. And we can get more into that later on. At 80%, we're seeing unhealthy relationship. And yes, this is unhealthy, especially if we're seeing the usage of power and control, intimidation. And some of you folks also said victim blaming and emotional abuse, which is also absolutely showing up. Thank you all. We'll go to the next one.
So for this next scenario, one partner forces the other one to have sex. When they try to say no, they threaten them and say they will tell their parents that you've been secretly dating. So we'll launch the next poll and give you a few moments to vote on this one. All right, we'll give a few more seconds here and then I'll end the poll and share the results. All right, so we're sharing the results. So power and control is definitely showing up, given that the sex is forced and that we know that power and control is the motive behind sexual assault. And as you all identified at 75%, this is an instance of sexual assault where consent was absolutely not present. We also have intimidation being present and emotional abuse, which is the threat that the person who harmed is using towards the end to keep the victim silent. And then we also had rape culture show up. We're going to be defining this pretty soon since it does manifest a lot, not as clearly in this situation. And then spiritual abuse potentially, given that the threat being used is known to be quite prevalent with regards to religious values that some people have. So spiritual aspects are being misused to keep the victim silent.
For this next one, a friend posts an article on Facebook about higher rates of sexual violence within LGBTQ communities. Later that evening, you see that your friend's post has been deleted. When you ask your friend why, they state that they received anonymous messages about how their post is spreading fitna, which is an Arabic term for trouble. So we'll go ahead and post up the poll for you to vote.
All right, we'll give a few more seconds since we're at about 75% voting.
Awesome. So everyone has basically said intimidation, and you're absolutely right. This idea of using intimidation as a way for someone to delete a message, especially when it comes to Muslim communities and sexual violence and the LGBT community. I also noticed that rape culture was chosen as well, and we can see kind of this interesting intersection of power and control, intimidation, emotional abuse, spiritual abuse. Because oftentimes what will happen and what we'll talk about later on is that there isn't just one form of violence that occurs at any given point. And so seeing that intimidation, spiritual abuse is coming up and emotional abuse, and in a sense, victim blaming is, you all are on point.
All right, we have one final scenario. You arrange for a discussion circle about sexual violence among Muslims with a group of your friends. A few of your male identifying friends state that this is a problem for women, and as long as a man doesn't rape someone, they're basically doing what they can. So we'll put up the poll for this one and give you all some time to vote. All right, we'll give it a few more moments and then we'll share the results. All right, so as you can see, you all chose rape culture as being the most prevalent factor that's showing up, and absolutely this idea that we'll talk about rape culture in detail coming up, that the men are using that to brush off any responsibility they have outside of their own actions. There is victim blaming as well, this idea that victims are responsible for both intervention and prevention for harm that's befalled upon them. And there were some other definitions that came up, such as gaslighting showed a high percentage too. And we'll define gaslighting, and that could be a case if somebody believes what somebody is saying to be the actual reality of what they think is happening. So we appreciate all of you participating and hope that the polls was a good way to engage in some dialogue.
So now we're going to get into the definitions. You all took a moment to participate in our polls, and it sounds like, or it seems like you all have somewhat of a great grasp of what the scenarios are and what's coming up. But we wanted to delve a little bit deeper and provide some definitions. So we're going to start off with just the definition for sexual violence. And this is all unwanted sexual acts, whether harassment, abuse, or assault, that is committed against another person without that person's freely given consent, and is considered not only sexual violence, but also a crime. We also want to go into the different types of sexual violence. And so what we know is that it's not just assault, it's not just harassment, but rather it could be a series of different things. And so what we have here in this slide is sexual harassment, sexual abuse, sexual assault, and child sexual abuse. And so to go a little bit deeper, sexual harassment, in this instance, we are defining it as unwanted sexual attention that one person inflicts on another. This can be verbal, physical, nonverbal, or even visual. And so in some of the scenarios that we had posted about, you saw some of these things come up, for example, explicit photos. Some other examples are subtle pressure for sexual activity, patting or pinching, deliberately brushing up against one another, the friendly arm around the shoulder, which doesn't sometimes or most of the time feel friendly, stalking, sending someone sending someone sexually explicit photos or pictures. For sexual abuse, we're defining that as non-consensual sexual conduct where the perpetrator is in the position of power and authority. Some examples of that is molestation, touching, caressing. For sexual assault, we're defining it as non-consensual sexual penetration. Examples of this are rape, attempted rape, penetration with an item or body part. And then for child sexual abuse, we're defining this as any sexual activity between a minor, under 17, and an adult. Examples include touching, exposure to explicit photos or body parts, any kind of sexual contact with a child, someone watching or photographing a child in sexual situations, things of that nature. One thing we also would like to note is if this is something that if there's a disclosure or if this is something of concern, to definitely check what the rules and regulations and policies are in your state in terms of reporting. We also want to state that there are other forms of abuse, and what you see in this slide is not as exhaustive, but we also wanted to say that other forms of abuse that can show up alongside sexual violence is physical, financial, online, spiritual, and emotional. Sexual violence can coincide with these, especially given that most of the times the person that is harming is known to the victim or survivor. And so in 2 weeks, we will get into power and control and talk about how some of these forms of abuse can show up, especially as it correlates with power and control, as it relates to sexual violence.
So with regards to victim blaming, you all were able to identify in the scenarios when that was occurring. And most of us have an intuitive sense of what this means because the name is pretty intuitive, where the victim is blamed for any wrongful action or harm that befalls them. Now, when we talk about Muslim survivors, victim blaming does tend to show up in very nuanced ways. For example, victim blaming is often tied to spiritual abuse, and so the victim's actions are interpreted from a moral lens, where people are questioning, why was that victim alone with this person? It's not in the place of a quote, good Muslim person to be alone with someone of the opposite gender. Oftentimes, the way a victim is dressed will be scrutinized from a moral lens. And essentially, the attention is spotlighted on the victim in a way that is very spiritual or religious in nature. And so we're pretty sure that if we were to ask you all to identify the ways this shows up in Muslim spaces, you'd probably be able to give very specific examples. Because it is quite prevalent within Muslim communities where we're still not putting the spotlight on people who harm, and we're over focusing on the victim's actions when they're the ones being oppressed. With regards to rape culture as well, we find that this is a pretty buzzwordy type of term. And we've also heard Muslims say in some of our workshops that rape culture does not exist in Muslim communities. And we absolutely want to push back against that and say that rape culture exists and it shows up in very distinct ways. For example, the ways in which Muslim women's choice of clothing, behavior, religious practice, in quotations, their presence at the mosque, and their leadership roles continues to be scrutinized, not only by Muslim men, but others who, in terms of creating an environment where Muslim women are hyper-focused and scrutinized, which we have seen objectifies women and those who are vulnerable, and then basically allows the perpetration of violence to exist and to go unquestioned. So with rape culture, we have to think of all these small microaggressions and the larger ones that our communities experience, and think how they're objectifying people so that when harm happens, the questions are placed on the victim instead of the person who harmed.
Another buzzworthy term is gaslighting, and something that we are seeing show up a lot. For gaslighting, it's this colloquial term that describes a type of psychological abuse, which again is another form of abuse that is used often in correlation with sexual violence, where the abuser denies the victim's reality, causing the person to question themselves, their memory, or even their perceptions. So it's a complete distortion of reality. And oftentimes a very common phrase that is related to gaslighting is the person that's on the receiving end feels like they're going crazy, in quotes, or that they're completely doubting themselves. In terms of seeing this within the context of Muslim communities, an example could be where a religious leader, for example, and a 17-year-old girl who is a youth leader at a mosque who he has been mentoring. So the imam sends her explicit photos by text. He's made physical advances on her when they're alone. So in this scenario, gaslighting would be where the religious leader telling the girl that their intimate relationship is permissible because they intend to marry soon, and the intentions are what makes those actions permissible. Her believing this to be the reality is gaslighting. For this particular example, it also ties into grooming that the perpetrator uses, where he uses his emotional relationship with the victim to manipulate their reality. So gaslighting is really honing in and focusing in on the fact that it's this manipulation of the reality of the survivor or victim and the usage of power and control by the person causing harm.
And just to pause to switch the spotlight video for the interpreter.
And we are coming close to the end of this, so just a quick time check for everyone. We're moving on to consent. So to think about consent, it must be freely given, verbally and in person. There can be no coercion present. And so a lot of folks have a grasp of what consent is, but oftentimes for some reason, it's not that black and white. So it not only does it have to be present in the moment, but it has to be present in the present. Wow, excuse me. It must be in the present moment as well. You also must be legally be able to give consent. So when I was describing child sexual abuse, I did mention that you needed to check what the policies and regulations were in your state. And this is because we wanted to share and disclose that when you are under the age of 18 or 17, given the state, it may not be legally permissible for them to give consent. And so that's something really important to understand. And also, an individual must understand what they are consenting to. When we think about Islam and within Islam, many people incorrectly think that consent is given at the time of nikah, which is a religious term which is an Arabic term for religious wedding. In Islam, there's a concept of consent called ridha, another Arabic word meaning fullness of choice. Outside of marriage, when someone enacts harm on someone else, the question of consent shouldn't even be there, given that oppression and harm have happened. And so what we can see is sometimes the use of marriage or the idea of marriage as a way as saying that this is consent is absolutely inaccurate. So really thinking about how consent shows up in a variety of relationships. So we also wanted to go a little bit into statistics. HEART, like I said before, one of our programming arms is research, and we have been doing a series of research, and one of them is the burden of sexual violence. Here on this screen, you'll see some of the mainstream statistics, and this is not necessarily Muslim specific, and that's just because while research lacks within the Muslim communities, these stats right here are no different, and we shouldn't have a reason to believe that within Muslim communities we're seeing some of these same rates, and if not, maybe a lot higher. So for example, 1 in 4 girls and 1 in 6 boys are assaulted, 1 in 4 undergraduate women are assaulted. We're also thinking about stats that are related to underreporting. And not in this webinar, but when you continue to follow our series, we'll go more in depth about disclosures and the barriers to disclosures from Muslim survivors.
So as Nabila mentioned, the research on Muslim statistics for sexual violence are lacking, and we will be releasing an online national survey in a few weeks that our team's been working on for a couple of years. And the slide that you're seeing is a college-based study that happened about 2 years ago. So for this study, 135 Muslim college students participated in a year-long HEART training series on their campus. And we gave them pre and post tests to test their knowledge and their comfort level with sexual violence and acting as an advocate on their campus. And there were also non-Muslim students that were mixed into those training groups. So we were able to compare through some research analysis that was done, this comfort level and knowledge of Muslim versus non-Muslim campus students. This study will be published this year, and this is just one chart that we like to show. So on the top bar, have been sexually assaulted. Sexually assaulted. With Muslims, only 25% knew 5 or more students. And there's a greater variety in how many friends Muslims knew who have been assaulted. So one could say maybe that's because sexual assault isn't happening as much in Muslim communities. But when we look at the other data that will be released, we actually saw that it's happening just as frequently. The problem is that, first of all, Muslims don't have the skills or the knowledge or comfort level to respond to survivors. And the second piece of that is that Muslim survivors don't feel comfortable disclosing their experiences, which, as Navila mentioned, provides a lot of barriers to knowing how many Muslim survivors there are. And more of this detail will be given in the third webinar. And we'd just like to share that we have to realize that there's a gap in Muslim knowledge to be able to provide support for survivors. And the last part of our webinar will be going into some facts about sexual violence within Muslim communities. This screenshot is a resource that's available on our website, and we'll be sharing the link with you after the webinar. I'll also try and paste it in the chat box coming up soon. And we have taken a lot of religious misunderstandings about sexual violence and created this document. And we're going to share about 5 of the most common misunderstandings about sexual violence prevention that show up with Muslims. So the first one that is quite common, and I'm pretty sure you all are intuitive about, is that what you wear does not prevent sexual violence. And there is an overemphasis in Muslim communities about victim blaming with regards to what somebody is wearing. Yet when you look at studies that are happening in Muslim countries where Islamic dress is mandatory, the sexual assault rates and sexual harassment rates are just as high as in countries where there's non-Islamic law happening.
Something else that does not prevent sexual violence is who you hang out with. Oftentimes there's a misunderstanding or a misperception that it's stranger danger. But the reality is that a perpetrator or a person who harms can be someone including family members, family friends, intimate partners, and so on. So we also just don't want to limit this to children, youth, but also adults, and really mention that it's really not about who you're hanging out with.
This one may seem pretty self-explanatory. I think you'd be surprised at how much we hear that being Muslim is prevention for sexual violence, and absolutely it's not. Muslims are not immune from committing harm against others. And the truth being is that a lot of communities continue to sweep sexual violence under the carpet and deny it. And we are in strong belief that the only way harm will stop is if people make the choice to not harm somebody else. And so religious practice, religious belief is not the solution. It's making the choice to not inflict power and control over somebody else.
Another thing that does not prevent sexual violence is strict rules for female identifying children in the family. Many Muslim families believe that this is the best protection against any sort of harm. And again, that's not true. The person who harms can be within the family. And that's something that we also really just want to remind folks, is that there is no particular stereotype for someone that would be identified as a person who harms or a perpetrator. And so what we're noticing is that this is showing up in Muslim families, is this idea, this culture around becoming really strict to female identifying individuals within the family and really restricting them.
And then I think I may have skipped a slide, or it's all good. We're just going with the flow.
Good.
The last one is getting married, and we talked about this already. So marital rape is a real thing, and even within Islamic religious law, there are a lot of Quran verses and hadith. Hadith are stories from the Prophet's time, as you may all know, that place a high emphasis on mutual pleasure during sexual relations. So the fact that marital rape goes against a lot of those religious beliefs means that it exists. And as Navila mentioned, consent within marriage must be present, this concept of rida. And so bringing all of this together, the Islamic wedding ceremony does not give consent. Signing the papers does not give blanket consent. Consent is ongoing, even and especially during marital relations.
We want to thank you all for joining us today. This is us concluding today's first of the series of our webinar. What we wanted to also let you know is that there's a few things. One is that next week, we have the second in our series with Aisha Rahman, who is one of our consultants and our guest speaker, and she's going to go over Islamic perspectives on sexual violence. We also want to share that we are going to have an online survey about sexual violence that's going to be launched soon, so please be on the lookout for that. Also, our webinar recordings are going to be made available. So as soon as this is over, we're going to post and we will be sharing this. We also wanted to, again, thank you all for joining us. And we hope to see you in our future webinars, and that in order to sustain the things that we do, our work online, all of our virtual programming, especially amidst COVID, that if there's anything that you can donate, please feel free. And also just sharing our links and our page. The Heart team is working really hard and diligently to be able to make things accessible to everyone. We are working really hard to make sure that our workshops, our trainings, everything that we tend to do in person can be made accessible to everyone virtually. It is a lot of hard work, but we're all, again, super excited to be able to have this opportunity and to shift a little bit during this time. Samira, definitely add anything I have missed.
I think you covered it all. Thank you to Keisha and Vernice, our fantastic interpreters, for joining us today. We're really blessed that we're able to provide interpretation and hope to continue with that. And lastly, when we close the webinar, a survey link's going to pop up. It's a 5-question survey about how the webinar was. We are looking to improve. So if you could please fill that out, we appreciate it. We'll see you next week. Take good care, please stay healthy, and see you soon.
Yes. And one more thing, if you all would like to stay updated with us, definitely sign up for our newsletters where we share all upcoming information and just our programming in general.
Take care, everyone. We'll see you soon.